Welcome back to That's a Good Word, a podcast designed to assist and equip Christians through advice from people in ministry. It is an honor today to have on Arielle Randle from Jews for Jesus. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to give you an opportunity to kind of just dive right in to your testimony, your story, and then what you do with Jews for Jesus.
Awesome. Yeah. Um, I grew up in a home where both of my parents had been raised in Jewish families and Jewish homes. And then as adults, they had both come to faith in Jesus as their Messiah, but wanted to continue on in the Jewish culture that they'd experienced, in their upbringing. And they actually met through Jews for Jesus and were discipled through Jews for Jesus and then raised me and my siblings in a home where we understood that we were Jewish and we had this incredible culture and legacy as Jewish people, but that so much of our faith and our understanding of the Hebrew scriptures pointed us to Jesus as our Messiah. And so I really grew up with, I think, the best of both worlds in that sense. But I think, like anyone who grows up hearing about Jesus, you have to, make a personal choice at some point to embrace him for yourself as your own, personal Messiah. And so for me, that happened really after I graduated college. I committed my life to the Lord, and then um, not long after, married my husband, and we started serving with Jews for Jesus, which really is just an amazing organization of Jewish people who want to share. We want to share with our own people that we've found the Messiah, and also we want to be a testimony and a witness to the world, to the Jewish people, but also to all nations that there are Jewish people that follow Jesus, and we're, I think, an important part of the diversity of, all tribes and nations and tongues that have embraced Jesus as Lord. So
Definitely.
yeah.
Definitely. So Jews for Jesus is an organization, we were talking before the podcast, primarily works with Jewish people and evangelizing them. Just talking about some of the things that y'all do and y'all's ministry, what the ministry overall does.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we are all about sharing the gospel with the Jewish people. That's what we do, in a nutshell. And we have different approaches, different ways that we do that in different places. Some of our approaches we call go and tell, and they're just very direct gospel proclamation where we send out missions teams, to campuses, to the streets. We send teams out onto backpacking trails. A lot of Israelis go on very specific backpacking trails around the world. We have ministry where we distribute New Testaments in Hebrew, especially in Israel, where it's very, very difficult to access a copy of the New Testament. We
Hmm.
see a lot of people come to faith through that ministry. We're starting to do more and more of just very hands-on discipleship, especially using online to connect with people, and then in person, bringing Jewish people, to visit a local church for the very first time. Most Jewish people have never set foot in a church before in their life, and
Right.
so that's our go and tell ministry. We also have another area of ministry that we call come and see, which is much more focused on hospitality, creating environments,
Hmm.
especially for someone, a Jewish person who might be very intimidated to walk into a church, but they might come to one of our community centers. We have a coffee shop in Manhattan, and another one in Los Angeles, and we're opening up another one soon in Tel Aviv. And we have other places and spaces around the world. We're in over a dozen cities around the world where we
Wow.
can invite Jewish seekers to come in and just experience. This is how we do Jewish life with faith in Jesus.
Right.
And then the third area of ministry that we focus on, we call love and serve, which is ways that we are meeting very felt needs of the communities that we're in, because we really think that communicating the gospel should be holistic, right? It needs to be our words, it needs to be our homes and our lives, and also our deeds. And so, for example, we have a lot of missionaries right now on the ground in Ukraine that are
Hmm.
serving people. There's so many needs there right now. A lot of people have lost their homes, been injured in the war that's there. And so just by providing food and aid and some of these really basic resources to people in need, our missionaries get so many opportunities to actually share the gospel. We saw over 100 Jewish people come to faith in Ukraine last year during the war, and a lot of the doors for that were opened up just by serving
Wow.
people in need.
Wow.
And obviously, we believe, we serve because Jesus set that example for us of loving our neighbors, and we believe there's value in that alone. But then we've also just been amazed how when you serve, God opens up amazing doors
Yes.
for the kingdom. So yeah, so that's sort of in a quick overview of what we do. Our largest work with the most of our missionaries are in the land of Israel because half of the Jewish people in the world today live in the land of Israel. So that's a very big focus for us.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah. And I'm going to give you an opportunity at the end also to stick around, talk about how you can support Jews for Jesus as an organization. So specifically kind of talking about some things about Messianic Judaism and kind of, people hear that word, they might not totally understand what that means. Just can you kind of define what Messianic Jews that believe in Jesus as the Messiah, Messianic Jews, what they are and what they believe?
Yeah, absolutely. So Messianic Judaism or Messianic Jews, it's kind of like an umbrella term to refer to Jewish people who believe in Jesus and want to practice their faith in Jesus in a Jewish cultural way. So, it's an umbrella term, maybe like evangelicals or
Mhm.
something. It's
Mhm.
there's a lot of different subgroups within that, right? So, Jews for Jesus, we are one organization within that larger body of Messianic Jews. And there's Messianic Jewish congregations and ministries and different groups around the
Yeah.
world. And there's just like, within evangelicals, right? There's a bit of diversity
Right.
of how people express that Jewish culture with faith in Jesus, but we have a lot in common as well.
Yeah. So, and basically, I guess some of the questions some people might have is do y'all, in terms of the Old Testament observance of the law, and do y'all still follow certain things within the law that maybe us evangelicals might not?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So that connects with what I said about diversity.
Right.
Within Messianic Judaism, you're going to find some people that really follow many of the commands of the law of Moses and many even rabbinic customs and traditions quite closely, and are very dedicated to that. And then you're going to find some who maybe live, what we might just consider a more uh, you know, um, mainstream Christian lifestyle, but maybe have a little bit of connection. They would celebrate some Jewish holidays from time to time because that's an important part of their culture. So you really see the diversity. Um, and as Jews for Jesus, we're very, we're careful not to speak for all Messianic Jews, right? We're
Right.
just one group. And we really emphasize the gospel's our main thing. And so that's really our focus more than anything. My personal thinking around it is, that in the Bible we see, that God had this special calling on the Jewish people to be a light to the
Mm.
nations. And so as Jewish believers in Jesus, we do have an obligation to take that calling seriously. And I think people have to sort of wrestle through for themselves what would enable me, to be able to have a witness and a testimony as a Jewish person. And I mean, I think that there's so much that we encourage the greater body when we have that identity as Jews, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows, oh, God keeps his promises to his people. I think people have to wrestle with, what level of, embracing my Jewish culture has God called me to in order to live that testimony out. And I think,
Mhm.
God leads people in different ways.
Right. But and you would say it's more of a cultural thing that they follow, that people would do. Messianic Jews, certain Messianic Jews would do law observance as a cultural thing. They're not necessarily are basing their salvation on that.
No, by and large, across Messianic Judaism, there would be an agreement that, our salvation is through Messiah, through his sacrifice. But I think that you would find some people who would feel that, God really has called us to
Mhm.
remain true to, the law of Moses, and some of these things as a way of maintaining that identity and that call to be a light to the nations, and others who might feel differently. It might feel like, no, it's been fulfilled,
Mm.
and I'm able to express that testimony in other ways. So I think you'd see like a spectrum of people's convictions on that.
Right, for sure. So when y'all work with Jewish people, and in terms of what they believe. Let's just say I go up to a Jewish person today and I say, "Hey, Jesus is the Messiah," and they say, "I don't believe that." Why would they disagree with me? Why would do Jews not? Why do Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah?
Well, I'm always very quick to say, not all Jewish people
Right.
reject Jesus as Messiah.
Sorry.
And that, no, 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 that's exactly why Jews for Jesus exists, right?
Mhm.
Because so many people think that all Jews have rejected Jesus, and it's really not true. Obviously, in the scriptures, we read about many, many, many Jewish people, all the writers of the New Testament, with maybe one exception who were passionate followers of Jesus as Jews, including even Paul and others. Throughout history, there always has been, at times a very small, but a remnant of Jewish people who
Right.
did profess faith in Jesus as Messiah. And now it's quite large. There's communities all around the world in many, many countries, large, thriving communities of Jewish people who are followers of Jesus. Um, the mainstream Jewish community would view, uh, not accepting Jesus, as part of
Right.
mainstream Judaism, right? And a lot of that has to do with what happened after the time of Jesus, when the temple was destroyed, and a lot of modern day Judaism was created actually after Jesus. So a
Hmm,
lot of
okay.
it was sort of built around to strengthen this idea of rejecting Jesus as Messiah. And so that's a lot of what Jewish people today have been exposed to. Many, many Jewish people aren't actually very familiar with the Hebrew scriptures themselves. Some are, but I would say your average Jewish person really has not read the Hebrew scriptures for themselves. And what they might know about the Jewish religion is really more like teachings and traditions of the rabbis. So they've maybe been taught Jews don't accept Jesus, but they might not know the reasons why. And that's why we always really challenge Jewish people. Hey, just read the Bible for yourself. Read the Hebrew scriptures for yourself. Read the New Testament. It was written by Jews. It's like the most
Right.
famous Jewish book ever. So I think that's really, really one of the keys is that a lot of Jewish people they might not even know why.
I guess so. What I'm thinking is, you're right. I mean, most of the you look at Paul's letters and Peter's letters and in the Book of Acts. I mean, most of the believers in post resurrection are Jewish believers. And certainly with Paul's ministry, there seems to be the Gentile Christians, that number seems to increase, but it's primarily Jewish believers at first, and then I guess after the fall of Jerusalem. Talk about what you said kind of with that new reformation of Judaism, how that kinda changed things, in terms of what they believe. Did they kind of reshape the way that the Old Testament scriptures should be understood, or the Old Testament should be, interpreted?
Yeah, these are very good questions. And let me give a disclaimer that I am not a historian by any means. And
Mm,
there's many, many great resources out there. Even on our website, jewsforjesus.org, we have articles about this, and a lot of ministries
right.
and groups, have put out books even on this. And so there's a lot that could be studied. From what I've studied, the way I think about it is kind of like, the Jewish people went into exile at the end of, the Old Testament. We read about, their exile for um for not following the law,
Mhm.
really, and for not following what God had really, it wasn't just their deeds, it was like their hearts. They hadn't embraced God's plan, for them in following him in many ways. And so I think when the people of Israel came back from exile, there was like a huge movement to really sort of follow the letter of the law and be almost legalistic about it, kind of like we never want to go into exile ever again. So it sort of
Right,
like swung to the opposite extreme almost.
right.
And we really see that. You really see that in Jesus' day, right? Like the Pharisees and, that the Jewish thinking was very much around like, we have to not just obey the law, but there was like this idea of creating almost a fence around the law to protect you from breaking the law. And, that's kind of like what legalism does. It just creates more and more barriers
Mm,
to try to keep people
yes,
um, from breaking the law.
definitely.
And you know, that really is sort of the origin of what we see as modern day Judaism today, right? So, like a lot of the Pharisaical teaching, and Jesus actually, in a lot of ways, had similar teaching to the Pharisees and engaged them as a peer. So it's not um, to cast a negative light on the Pharisees per se. I think in a lot of ways they were trying to follow God's command, but
Right.
over time, it just became that the teachings of the rabbis became more and more and more, and there became more and more sort of like laws and traditions that were very far removed from the original command in the scripture and the
Mm.
original intent behind God's command. Um, so yeah, so then I think, and then the temple's destroyed, and then there became more like, well, the rabbis, started to say, well, instead of a sacrifice, we'll do good deeds, or they started to kind of reinterpret the law for a new era without the temple,
Right.
and you can kind of almost in some sense say that's sort of like what the New Testament is as well. Some of the like it's sort of explaining how are we going to do Judaism now without a temple, right? It's like, but the way the New Testament answers those questions is, God's spirit is going to live within you as you're going to have be a temple of his spirit. And Jesus made one sacrifice of atonement that's now sufficient for all and for the world. So the New Testament answers a lot of those questions,
Yes.
and then the rabbinic teachings answer those questions in a way to sort of guide people away from Jesus and from the very growing expression of Christianity,
Right.
right? So a lot of rabbinic Judaism was actually the school of thought was to differentiate itself from Christianity, which was really growing at that
Mm.
time. So that's why, even though they really started, together, and
Yes.
then they went, in very different directions. But that's why I think you point people back to the heart of the scriptures, then you realize like, oh, these things all like come from this source and they're actually really in harmony. If you go back to the beginning.
Yes, yeah, and I think we see that, I mean, even in the Gospels as well. I mean, Jesus many times when he calls out the Pharisees, he doesn't necessarily call them out because they're misinterpreting scripture. He says that they're using this thing called the tradition of the elders or rabbinical literature
Exactly.
that isn't even part of the Old Testament. It's an interpretation of the Old Testament that comes later on. And they're using that, and then I like the point you made, about idolatry, right? So, I mean, we see that, in Acts 7 with Stephen's sermon, right? So the temple wasn't the issue with with Judaism. The temple was not the issue with the Jewish people. The issue was their idolatry of the temple and of um, certain things that with the laws and certain issues there. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely see, Jesus' frustration, right, with how, and I think, it's funny, it's like the Jewish people are the example, but I could totally see Jesus having this same frustration today, coming
Yes.
into our modern
Yeah.
church and seeing things that he would say, these things are distracting people from worshiping me, or these things are, making a lot of money. And is that how you should be using
Mm,
my name? And so I think you see Jesus reacting to those things at that time
mm.
of like how a lot of money was being made in the temple, and we read about him throwing over the tables, and there was a court at that time called the Court of the Gentiles. And so Gentiles weren't allowed to come in all the way into the temple. And that's, where you see Jesus saying things like, my house is a prayer for all nations, right? He had this vision of, that the God of Israel should be, was inclusive and wanted all people to be drawn to him and
Yeah.
not just Jewish people. So um, yeah, and I think a lot of people today still resonate with those things, right? God's heart for all nations, and Jewish people today think a lot about how can we make Judaism more inclusive. So, I mean, Jesus, I think, was ahead of his time.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure. And the issue, I wasn't trying to specifically say about Jewish people. I mean, the issue of idolatry is for everyone. I mean, and Paul in his letters talks about that to the Gentiles. I mean, I saw a quote one time that said if Paul was alive today, the American church would be getting a letter. That's definitely true. So
Yeah,
it, we've kind
that's
of
good.
put ourselves in that position as well many times, and a lot of it's because of our materialistic culture and all the
Absolutely.
things that
Yeah.
we have and are fortunate to have that God's given us, but we have abused them. So I want to talk a little bit about seeing Christ in the Old Testament because there are people out there that we love to talk about prophetic fulfillment of what Jesus has done. And there's just so much in the Old Testament and what Jesus fulfills, right? I mean, it's sometimes we kind of I know maybe just me, I say, okay, well, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament and kind of just leave it there. But, just for our listeners and just talk about where we see Jesus in the Old Testament fulfilling these scriptures, just some places.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, like,
Right.
that's not I mean, what you said is true. He did fulfill it in just a million ways, and it's amazing. I mean, that's sort of the beauty of the scriptures, right? You could study it your whole life and
Mm.
still be learning new connections and new ways that these things are fulfilled. I mean, one that is really close to my heart because, I grew up celebrating Passover every year and just really love that holiday a lot. Is just when you look at the Passover, and you see how, God redeemed the people of Israel from
Mhm.
slavery and bondage to Pharaoh, and how much that narrative really is the human narrative, right? That's the gospel. Like each one of us have been slaves to sin, and we need the blood, the blood of the Lamb, the blood of our Redeemer, to be spared from the angel of death to step into freedom and life.
Yeah.
And especially, I think for a lot of Christians when they know how some of the different things connect, like especially with the Last Supper being a Passover celebration, and there's a lot of meaning connecting into the Passover story.
Yeah. Do you want to dive into that if you like? Kind of just dive out because I know you've spent time talking about that. You want to dive into the Last Supper specifically?
Sure. Yeah, I'll share a little bit more about that. When Jesus was at that Last Supper, which again was a Passover celebration,
Right.
probably like the most famous Passover celebration ever recorded
Right.
in history, right? And he took the bread and he said, "This is my body." What he was talking about was this unleavened bread, which in Jewish tradition, the unleavened bread is a picture of a sinless nature.
Hmm.
And the unleavened bread, when it's made, it's pierced and it's striped, which reminds us of so many passages about Jesus. By his stripes we are healed. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced. So you have kind of this picture of like a bread of life. It wasn't just any bread. Jesus was taking this very specific symbolic bread
Yeah.
in Judaism and saying, "This is my body." And then he was taking this very specific cup. In Jewish tradition, the cup taken on Passover after dinner is the cup of redemption, which is supposed to represent the blood of the lambs. And so he said about this very, very specific cup, with all of that meaning and all of that history, this cup is a new covenant in my blood. And so Jesus wasn't making up something new when he took these elements and said, "These are about me." He was actually connecting in with a narrative that was already thousands of years old about the sacrifice of the Passover lambs. And so he was fulfilling them, but also giving us something very tangible by which to remember him and understand his sacrifice on a deeper level. And so I mean, there's so much more that could be said about that. It's very, very rich. And there's a lot of great materials out there. I mean, if you just Google Christ in the Passover, we have a lot, Juice for Jesus, we have, videos and articles that dive a lot more into those teachings. But I think for all Christians, it's only going to make our faith and our customs richer when we understand all the Jewish historical context of what was happening in Jesus' day.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely changes the way that you think about Passover and I guess what we call the Lord's Supper that we take. Definitely changes the way that you think about that.
Yeah.
For sure. And when you're sharing the gospel with Jews, do you kind of try to point out to them specific scriptures in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills in the New Testament? I guess like Isaiah 53 or something like that. Do you kind of try to go through some of those?
Yeah, Isaiah 53 is one of the most common passages that we'll share with Jewish people. And I've seen this happen many times. Myself, I have, seen uh, where you're sitting with a Jewish person and you read to them from Isaiah 53 and they'll say, stop reading to me from the New Testament. And you'll say, "No, this is from the Hebrew scriptures." And it's like shocking to them. They've never seen anything like that before in Jewish tradition. And we even in Israel sometimes, I know some of our missionaries there even will use like a copy of the Bible from the IDF, from the Israeli Defense Forces, to say, no, no, look, like this is the Jewish people's scriptures. It has not been changed. This is what it says. And it's so hard to deny that it sounds just like Jesus.
Yeah.
Even someone who knows very little about Jesus, which many people know extremely little about Jesus, but they still are often just really compelled by that passage. Um, yeah, I think, I mean, there's other passages that are used a lot, in sharing the gospel. I think that, Jewish people today are extremely diverse. So what you might share with someone who is, maybe very secular could be very different than what you might share with someone who's very religious, who already is a bit more familiar with many of the scriptures and the passages. And um, some Jewish people today, you have to start all the way at the beginning. Like,
Yeah.
does God exist? Because there's less and less just religious education that people are growing up with
Yeah.
today.
I know you mentioned earlier about there are a lot of Jewish people, like you said, that don't know the Hebrew scriptures. Is it more of just a traditional type of do they still follow traditions within Jewish custom? Is that kind of what they ascribe their Judaism to? Or just more of their ethnic background?
Both. You really see both. I mean, uh, I think a big factor is that for millennials, for Gen Z, right? Like people our age,
Mhm.
50% or more grew up in intermarried homes. So 50% of people who are Jewish had one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent. So you're seeing a huge rise of a generation who they're Jewish, but they're Jewish and something else, and often maybe they're Jewish and Catholic. And so they've gotten a little bits and pieces of different religions, and they really need support in sorting it all out because it just seems like kind of a hodgepodge of things oftentimes.
Mhm.
And people are really struggling with like, how does this make any sense? And so I think that's a huge open door for the gospel
Yeah.
because we have a lot of people who are asking these questions like, how can I fit these different pieces of my identity together? And actually, Jesus is the way, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you have Jesus, then the other pieces can fall into place, and you can be Jewish, and you can be Christian, and you can, have whatever cultural background that you have. That's like what I love so much about faith in Jesus is we see cultural expressions of faith in Jesus from all corners of the earth, and there's room for people to have their own, like unique cultural understanding of how they practice their faith, and Jesus can bring that unity.
Yeah. I mean, talking about, just Jewish belief, I mean, you mentioned earlier how there's Jews believe different things, especially about, or the Old Testament, the New Testament as well. I think sometimes, I mean, we see that in our Bible interpretation today. Like when we interpret the New Testament, I think a lot of people, America will say they'll read a passage maybe from the Gospels and it's Jesus talking to the Pharisees or just some Jewish group, and they say, "Well, Jews believe this during this time," and it's like, well, maybe a subsection of Jews, but not all Jews. And I mean, um, Paul was a Pharisee, but he wouldn't, he wouldn't necessarily have agreed, with Sadducees about certain things, and there was differences there. So I imagine in Judaism, there's also denominations. I guess kind of how we use it. That's the term we use, but
Yep.
like denominations and different types of
Yeah,
as
people
well.
often say like different branches of Judaism, but it's very similar, yeah, to
Okay,
how there's different denominations within the Christian church. Yep.
right. And then, that with Messianic Judaism, is that also the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's smaller, so there's less, but yeah, there's a number of different like affiliations that different groups have. Yep.
Mm. When y'all are, evangelizing to Jewish people, I mean, do you have kind of just some experiences that you've had doing that? Maybe some stories you could share on that?
I do have stories, but I want to share a story of someone who, well, I guess, I was involved, but who originally heard the gospel from a Christian.
Mhm.
Because I think a lot of Christians are very intimidated to share with a Jewish person. And so I want to, destigmatize that a little bit. It's not as scary as you think.
Right.
One, because of what I already shared about that a lot of Jewish people have a lot less knowledge of the scriptures than Christians might assume. So don't be intimidated. I've heard Christians say, like, I could never share with a Jewish person. They have the whole Bible memorized. And I'm like, trust me, they don't. Like, that would be very unusual.
Right.
Many Jewish people just like many Christians. You meet Christians all the time who are
Yeah.
they've been to church one time on Easter, but they
Yes.
really would know quite a minimal amount about their own faith. Uh, but I'll tell you about a friend of mine who was working in a restaurant, and someone came in and just saw, they had some Hebrew, some is the news in Israel on TV in Hebrew, and this person came in and started. Actually, the person just came in like to use the restroom, right? A Christian person, but saw the Hebrew on the TV and just said, "Wow, I really love the Jewish people." And this friend of mine was shocked. And a lot of Christians do not realize that a lot of Jewish people have heard and think that Christians hate Jews. And like, oh, they hate us because they blame us for killing Jesus. And there are Christians, that do have, really terrible, rhetoric like that. So it's not to say it doesn't exist, but there's also a lot of Christians who deeply, deeply love the Jewish people and are so, grateful to the Jewish people for, writing the Bible and for, bringing the Messiah and all these things.
Right.
And a lot of times a Jewish person is like totally in shock to hear to hear a Christian say, "I love the Jewish people. I pray for the Jewish people. I'm so thankful for the Jewish people." That to them would be um, completely against what they've ever heard about
Mhm.
Christians. And that is a extremely powerful witness. And so this friend of mine started a conversation with this guy. Like, really? I thought, Christians hate Jews. I thought that, you guys hate us for killing your Christ, and this guy then was able to share the gospel with him. And then they struck up a friendship. And over time, he connected this guy with a Jewish ministry, which is how I ended up meeting him. And then he came to faith a number of months later. And that's what actually we see a lot in Jews for Jesus. We see a lot of times where God used a Christian to plant a seed in a Jewish person's life, and then they'll come to us. We get people on our website. We have a live chat on our website, and we get people on our website every day of the year, Jewish people that will come on and say like, "I'm so drawn to Jesus and I don't know why. And I have so many questions. Am I the only Jewish person in the world who is asking questions about
Yeah.
Jesus?" And then we're there, Christians plant the seed, and then we're there to sort of water the seed and say, "No, you're not alone. Well, you can have support on this journey. There's other Jewish people who've walked through this. We know what it's like to tell your family, and we know what it's like to navigate some of the questions that Jewish people have."
Yeah, for sure. Right. That's an encouragement, I think, to all Christians to, never be afraid to share the gospel. I mean, I heard someone say that if you know enough of the gospel, if you know the gospel, you know enough to share.
Oh,
To
yeah.
share
And you
for
never
sure.
know. I mean, I had a girl once that I met with her in a Starbucks in Chicago. This was years ago, and shared the gospel with her and wrote down some, Bible verses on a napkin
Yeah.
in Starbucks. I gave it to her. I didn't hear from her for years. And then I saw her on Instagram stories saying, "I've become a follower of Jesus." And then I texted her like, "Oh, I saw you on Instagram." And she texted me a picture of that napkin with the Bible verses.
Wow.
I had totally forgot
Yeah.
about that conversation. It was years later, but you just never know how God is going to use something, in someone's life, and you just take a step of faith and share something. He will bless it. He will use it.
Yeah, for sure. With Juice for Jesus, is it mainly, I mean, do y'all offer opportunities for people to go to different parts of the world and share, or is it mainly, y'all outreaching yourselves? Do y'all have, like, opportunities to travel and stuff like that?
We do have volunteers, and we do sometimes work with groups that come to Israel or other places to serve. And if anyone's interested in getting involved, it's really easy. You can just go on our website,
Right.
juiceforjesus.org, and there'll be a link in the menu to get involved, and just fill out the form, and we can connect you with whatever opportunity would be a good fit. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Talking about, did your parents you said your parents are Messianic Jews. They come to faith in Christ, or did they grow up as Messianic Jews as well?
No, no, they both grew up in mainstream, Jewish homes.
Okay.
My mom grew up a little bit more like traditional reform. people say, and then, her family actually now has become much more religious, over time, and some now are ultra Orthodox Jews, and
Yeah.
she's the only believer in Jesus in her family.
Wow.
And my dad actually grew up with his Jewish stepmother and his Jewish sister, and they're much more just like secular
Yeah.
Jews, like they're Jewish in culture, but not practicing anything of the Jewish religion, mostly
Yeah.
just like atheists.
If you don't mind me asking, I mean, maybe like for your mom specifically, how did she come to faith in Christ, especially growing up in a family that where there was no other believers in Messiah?
Yeah, no, and you know what? There's a video of her on YouTube sharing her testimony, so I'll have to
Okay.
give you the link, and then we
Yeah.
can put it, below if people want to see
For
it.
sure.
But
Yeah, definitely.
um, yeah, she had, I think, always had like a feeling that for her something was really missing from Judaism, and something like didn't connect. And oh, in Judaism today, which, as I told you, is quite far removed in many ways from the heart of the Hebrew scriptures, in,
Right.
in my view. Um, there's not an emphasis really at all on a personal relationship with God.
Mhm.
You don't know God for yourself, and people usually only pray even from like a prayer book.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just pray from your heart. And one time someone was at my house, and my husband and I prayed over a meal, and then he said, "Wow, I really like that, freestyle." Like, it was like he'd never seen somebody pray without praying from a book.
Hmm.
So I think my mom had always, like, desired something deeper, and we see that a lot. People will reach out to us and say, like, "I just always felt like something was missing in Judaism." Like, there's so much there, and it's wonderful, but there's, like, a piece, or, there's a personal relationship with God that they're longing for. And so she met a Christian woman. My mom's from New Jersey, and she lived in New York City. Met a Christian woman in New York City who shared the gospel with her. And my mom, right away, before she knew that it was Jesus, she had this sense like, what this woman has is that thing that I felt was missing. And then I think she was very surprised when this woman told her it was
Right.
Jesus. But she prayed with this woman, and, really felt like after that, God's presence came into her life, a personal presence that
Yeah.
then is still with her now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, and one thing you said right there, I find interesting that there is not a personal relationship. I mean, do you find that, while I was talking with Candy about this with Muslim people that they found this, but specifically talking about Jewish people, is it the more of the the new Judaism now that comes after the time that we talked about, that comes after the time of Jesus? Is it less there's less focus on a personal relationship with God? Because I think we see in the Old Testament there is that focus on a personal relationship with God, but that's less the focus now in current day
Yeah,
Judaism?
absolutely, absolutely. I think that now, there's a huge focus in Judaism on Jewish survival
Mm.
because of, how much persecution there's been. So there's a huge focus on protecting the community and the unity of the community, and that's really, really a big focus. It's more communal, which in some ways has its benefits, right? To
Right.
where there could be expressions of Christianity that are extremely individualistic, like, well, it's just you and God, and you don't need to think about the bigger community. So I think there's power in that emphasis on the community, but I think what's lost in that emphasis is that people don't really talk or think at all about knowing God for yourself.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. Really, really appreciate you doing
Yeah,
this.
no,
And
thank you so much for having me.
yes, and so I want to give you an opportunity. I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, but just kind of to reiterate some ways you can get involved with Jews for Jesus and some resources you could look at and just how we can help out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely recommend follow us on social media. We put out, articles, on Facebook, Instagram, on YouTube, and actually on all our platforms. We post interviews and videos, stories of Jewish people, how they came to know Jesus. Jewish people of all different backgrounds, and some of their stories are amazing. Like people who, had visions and miraculous encounters where they met Jesus and they never really heard of Jesus before. So definitely, definitely, follow us on social media. You'll be really blessed by those stories and the resources. And we really need Christians who have a heart for the gospel going to the Jewish people to pray that God would work among the Jewish people and to give generously that we can continue sharing the gospel. Because, these are God's chosen people and they're supposed to be a light to the nations, right? But they can't be that light if they don't know the light. And so you can go anytime on our website, jewsforjesus.org, and make a gift, and we'd be so honored to have you as a partner in this work.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much. If you enjoy our content, please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel as well. And we will do our best to put a link in the description for Juice for Jesus and some resources there where you can go and check that out as well. So I'm Wilson Paris, and that's a good word.